Okay, what happened? What did I turn it around? There we go. So yes, Dan, Divers Alert Network, has a huge presence at the DEMA shows every year, and they try to bring in the dive professionals and discuss things that happen, dive accidents that happen, ways to avoid trouble, situational awareness. But the ones that fascinate me the most are the ones that talk about decompression. And that's what these three are really experts at. Now I'm going the wrong way. There we go. So when we build up the nitrogen bubbles in our tissues, it causes extreme pain. It causes a bunch of symptoms that Vance is going to talk about. We can avoid that by avoiding the things that bring it on. We can't avoid multiple dives. We all like to dive, and we like to do a lot of them. But what we can do is manage the profiles. We can avoid ascending too quickly, which will bring on the bubbles. And the one thing about it is it's not very predictable. A lot of people will do foolish things and not have decompression sickness. A lot of other people will drive very conservative profiles and what we don't consider dangerous, and we'll still end up with it. So what we can do is there are certain things to avoid the situation and reduce our risk, and that's the best we can do. A little bit of definitions. As we talked about the decompression sickness, the medical condition caused when bubbles form in the tissues. The more serious situation is an arterial gas embolism, which can be brought on a number of ways. We've all heard about don't hold your breath while you're diving. You can bring bubbles up into the bloodstream. And when a bubble lodges in the arteries, it causes something that's similar to a stroke. Is the oxygen cannot get to certain parts of the body. And DCI, decompression illness, is really both of these things above. It's a medical condition caused by overexpansion or bubbles forming, and that's when we get into some real trouble. So the anatomy of DCS, when we're breathing gas under pressure, as hopefully you all know, the regulator is designed to give us gas at the same pressure as the air, the water around us. So as we increase the pressure in the regulator becomes higher than the pressure in our body. When it's in your body, it's actually called tissue tension, but I will use the terms pressure and tension interchangeably. As we decrease the pressure on the way up, the reverse happens. The gas that's in the tissues has to travel to the blood and then into the lungs, and then it's expelled in the breathing gas, and it comes out as we breathe. The reason that we talk about nitrogen all the time and not oxygen, oxygen is bioactive. So the cells in the body know what to do with the oxygen. They use it up. So the nitrogen is inert, and it doesn't have a real place in the body as far as usefulness goes. So it ends up getting expelled, or it ends up forming bubbles. I've got several stories I'm going to tell about the DCS situations. These are real life stories that I've heard over time. Mr. K was on a dive boat in the Caribbean, wanted a bigger tank, and they gave him a Steel 100. Now, some of you may have used the Steel 100 before. They're extremely heavy and negative. I don't know what the specific tanks were that were in use here, but the Faber 100 is a high pressure 100. and it's 14 pounds negative when it's full. The regular lux for the aluminum tanks that we normally get in aluminum 80 is minus 1.4 when it's full. And as you know, as it empties, it becomes buoyant. So what this does, the same situation we see with a lot of novice divers. In an overweighted situation, the only thing you can do is put more air into your BC, and it balances you, but it reduces the zone of stable neutral buoyancy. You might only have a few feet one way and another. If you go down a little bit, you'll start to sink. If you come up a little bit, you'll start to float. It gets very difficult to maintain your buoyancy when you're in that kind of a situation, which is why we encourage everybody to keep dropping lead until you're very neutral. So what you end up doing is a yo-yo profile. You almost can't help it. You're up and down over the course of the dive. And several hours later, what he noticed was a rash and a bubbling in the skin. Sometimes it appears as like a crackling under the skin. And that is what they call cutaneous DCS or skin bends. Now, it's not that serious a situation. In this case, he was able to recover without medical intervention. Now, a little bit about history. In the early 1800s, man wanted to go and see things that he had never seen before, try things out. The Montgolfier brothers invented a hot air balloon, and guys started going higher and higher into the atmosphere. And in 1804, they made it to 23,000 feet of altitude. What they noticed was that they were getting dizzy. What we would say, the air's thin up here. What we now know is that the partial pressure of oxygen was dropping as they kept the altitude going. The pressure was so low that they begin to black out. There's also the exploration with increased pressure, and several guys came up with the idea that they could invert a giant barrel and sit inside of it and sink to the bottom and go exploring. Some of these even had some of them even had a window on top that they could see out, and it would bring in some light as they were down there. Does anybody see the problem with this kind of a situation? At this time, there was no compressors. They might have had some simple hand pumps. If you brought this kind of a system down to 33 feet, what's going to happen? That guy's going to be up to his neck in water. It's going to press in through the bottom. This guy out here, unless he's above this air chamber, he's not going to be able to breathe like that. And if he is above the chamber, it's going to take the air from the chamber and it's going to bubble out. This barrel over here that he designed to carry spare air is at atmospheric pressure. So if he was to open the valve, he would actually be sucking air out of the chamber and go into the barrel. So it's not very practical, but it's a clever idea. As we get to the mid 1800s, guess what? They had compressors. So now they're able to pump air where they needed it. What you ended up having was these, what is that? Oh. They had these caissons. When guys were building bridges or piers or tunnels, they would take this big concrete device, they'd float it out where they needed it, or they would sink it in place with cranes, and they pump air down into this chamber. And if you see down here, that's a bunch of dudes down there shoveling the bottom, and they put it into buckets and they bring it back up. What they didn't realize was they're under the same pressure that we are when we're diving. These guys who work 70 or 80 feet under the river or under the ocean, and then they would come up through these tubes and they would basically they go through an airlock and they would just open the hatch. So they were working hard physically for 8 to 10 hours under there, and then they would just pop it open. And what ends up happening, the tissue's all filled with nitrogen bubbles, and they got what they called Caison's disease, named after the device that they're in. And they called it the bends, the chokes, the Caison's disease. But that was early examples of decompression sickness. And the same thing goes with the so-called hard hat divers. Navy calls it standard dress. These guys were going down to depth, and then they just pull them back to the surface. So here's a couple of heroes of mine, Albert and John Scott Haldane. However, you would not have wanted to know these guys if you were friends of theirs. They both worked with pressure chambers, and they would take anything that would sit still, including their friends, their family, their farm animals. They took pigs and goats and whatnot, stick them in pressure chambers, and then release the pressure at various rates and try to figure out what was going on. It's reminded me of some of those gothic horror novels from the 19th century, the Frankenstein, the Island of Dr. Moreau, those kinds of things. These guys are mad scientists. But they did understand what the dissolved gases were doing, and they were the first ones to really figure this out. Paul Burt is in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, and John Scott Haldane was a little bit after. But they experimented with higher than normal pressure, lower than normal pressure, and they started to figure out what partial pressures were all about and how it affected the body. To this day, we still have what we call the Burt effect, and that is what happens when we have an oxygen toxicity in the central nervous system. And if you breathe pressurized oxygen for too long, you'll black out. And that's still to this day why we do the calculations for nitrox when we're increasing the oxygen content. We have to understand about maximum operating depth. What Paul Burt did was a gradual decrease. He would stick somebody in a chamber and then just gradually let the pressure off. As I said, animal experiments, I saved you the pictures. I have pictures of goats and pigs and stuff that you don't want to see. Paul Burt believed in the constant gradual decrease, and John Scott Haldane figured out that you could decrease in stages. You could basically decrease it a little, wait a while, decrease it a little, wait a while. And the concept of tissue compartments is really how fast your various tissues will absorb the nitrogen. There's faster tissues, there's slower tissues. It's really just a mathematical trick to allow us to make the calculations necessary. The first tables that John Scott Haldane came up with were based on 2-to-1, and that means he could reduce the pressure by half. The tissue pressure was 2, the external pressure was 1, and he found that that was enough to keep people, for the most part, pretty safe. I keep holding this upside down. So John Scott Haldane came up with the first real dive tables, and he sold those to the Navy. The Navy commissioned him, the British Navy, Royal Navy. And those tables withstood from about 1906 all the way to the 1950s. In the 1950s, Captain Workman came along. He was a medical doctor. These are the new US Navy tables that they've been modified, but we're still using them. That's what you see published as the Navy tables. And he developed a series of what he called M values. That's the maximum value that the maximum ratio of what you can get from the tissue pressure versus external pressure. He concentrated on more of a 1.6 to 1. His divers in the experimental dive unit were doing longer dives, deeper dives. And what he found was that 1.6 was the M values, and you see that come up again. And he also had divers that were going for a long time. So he added a bunch of tissue compartments. His tissue compartments were based on 8 different time periods for the gas to come out of the tissues. In these days, both of these guys, Dr. Buhlman came along later and refined it even more, but they were moving from the days of having tables to more of the equations and formulas that we can use in modern dive computers. Keep getting this backwards. This is the pressure chart. I was going to get into an explanation of what the pressure chart was about, and I decided that this is not the right audience or the right venue for doing that. It's very complicated, but basically when you go from the tables to here, you're able to use your dive computer, and the dive computer will make thousands of calculations over the course of a dive, and it's going to compute this. This profile here is a very complex profile of a guy. He was probably down 100 meters and spent an hour down there. And so all of these represented the various tissue compartments. I'll get this right eventually. So most of what those guys developed was based on technical diving. The Buhlman formulas are still being used by most of our tech divers. These two guys came along and said, what about us recreational guys? What about the guys that don't plan to go into deco? So they came up with a couple of new models, the reduced gradient bubble model and the variable permeability model. These are the algorithms that most of our modern dive computers use. The tech divers get the shear water and they use the Buhlman. For most of us that are doing recreational diving, we use either the reduced gradient bubble model or the variable permeability model. This is yours.
All right, so these next few slides, and there's more of them than I started with, thanks to Carl, who made them more legible than what I had. Came out of the older class that I had actually been through a long time ago on the science of diving. And mostly what I wanted to show here was, I don't expect you to read all that. I'm not going to go through all this, but I wanted you to get a feel for the complexity of what we're dealing with. As I tell my students, none of these things that he was just talking about, don't take any of this personally. The dive tables have nothing to do with you. They are mathematical creation. The tissues are real. I mean, you do have tissues and they do take up nitrogen at different speeds and they let it out differently at different speeds as well. But the tissues they're talking about are not actual real things. So it's all statistical. If you happen to be in that statistical middle, you're good. If you're not, you're not. So I do point out you should never walk up to the edge of the cliff and look over. Step back. Don't go to zero on your computer. Don't go deeper than you're supposed to with nitrox. All of that stuff. Stay away from the edge. And we'll see here in a minute all of the predispositions to it. Age being one of the things I have done out of my stupidness. When I got past my stupid stage, I started to realize I could get hurt here. So I tended to, and when I started teaching other people, that made me a little more paranoid about all this. So I kind of back away from the edge. as much as I possibly can. And if I don't, if I make a mistake or whatever, then I'm just lucky. The fact that I'm still standing here means that I was lucky. In 1965, when I got certified, they assumed pretty much that you couldn't stay down long enough with the tank you had. There was no, we had a gauge, but even just before that, you didn't even have a gauge. You just ran out of air, pulled down on a little J valve, right? And you get 500 more PSI, and then you come up. That's how they knew. And you weren't going to get bent because you couldn't stay down long enough. The deeper you went, the more air you used. So totally forgetting about people who had some more experience could stay down longer, all of that kind of stuff. So somehow we managed to survive all that. And then they came up. So computers, so we were using tables, and then computers came up, and that changed everything. Computers have changed everything. But even the computers, do not take any of that personally. What it's telling you is a mathematical construct. You want to pay attention to these predispositions that I'm showing you, and take that into account when you're doing your diving. So dehydration is a biggie in Mexico, right? So, and if we tell you not to drink, so that's obvious. Don't go diving drunk. Why? Because you make bad decisions, right? Just like everything else, any other place you are with it. But if so, you're drinking all night or in the evening and late in the evening, and then you wake up with a hangover. What is that? Dehydration. So just having a hangover makes you a little more predisposed to this problem. Obesity is there. It's the fat, the adipose tissue takes it up slower, but it also lets it out at a different speed, a little slower. So you've got bubbles coming out from that tissue a little longer than other things. This is why that is. Physical exertion, all of these things. The ones that we teach mostly don't come up fast, right? But other than that, you can see the lift. Oh, yeah, go ahead. So there's a few more. Temperature, you can start to see. This is very complicated, very complex physically for you. So certain drugs, part of some of the drugs change your behavior. That's never a good idea to go underwater like that when your behavior is changing, but they can also predispose you to getting DCS. And which drugs there are, you talk about diving doctors, and he has the name of dives, and also a doctor who can get more information about those drugs. Multi-level dives without a computer. If you didn't have a computer and you've been diving a while, you know that PAD and SSI both, they made a big deal out of that multi-level business. So there was a lot more complicated calculations that you had to make when you were going to do that. And decompression on air, that's really kind of crazy. If you read this book, Shadow Divers, they were diving on a submarine 270 feet, something like that, on air. This is back at the beginning of when they were trying to figure it out. And more than one person died on to figure out tech dive that way. So they didn't understand about gas narcosis. They didn't understand a lot of things, and they were trying to do that. So that's what that book, part of that book is about. A lot of people dive trying to get to that, some in there. And then taking your chance, breaking the rules, breaking the tables, as we call it, or letting the computer go to zero. So you don't want to do any of that. Okay. All right. So I'm going to show you the symptoms. You can see state for Red Cross, and you just have symptoms. They all these possible things that can happen to you look the same. You can see all these symptoms can make it seem like you've got the flu, like you've got a hangover, like you've got a lot of different things, as you can see. What we mostly talk about is the very, very harsh things that can happen to you if you take it, if you're just unlucky or take it to the maximum problem. So swelling. So what is the most likely thing you're going to feel? This is Dan telling us the most likely complaint people have when they have bends. Pain, right, pain. That's why they call it the bends, because those folks in the caissons, the caisson disease, eventually those guys. So these are old guys in their 30s by that time. They're all bent over. They're trying to get to a position where it's more comfortable. That's what that bends all about. They were all bent over, couldn't stand up straight. They had a lot of pain. Damage was being done by all that. And then there's stuff that I'd never seen before. I took that class, the respiratory rate, the blood pressure, all of these kinds of possibilities. Okay. And even more. Numbness, pins and needles, tingling, weakness, tunnel vision, paralysis. So besides the pain, the worst thing is to get the bends, get nitrogen in your spine, and that's causing paralysis. A lot of other things. So those are usually, unless you're very lucky, those are things you really take to the very end. You know, go way beyond the tables, way beyond the computer. Take your chances. Come up too fast because you panic. These are things that can cause that kind of problem. Right. So most likely people are going to find that they're just feeling really bad and they've got pain in places where they normally don't. At my age, I could hardly tell where that would be. but I say that laughingly, it's not quite so bit laughingly. Anyway, it's going to be worse than you experience normally. Put it that way. So come up, and after a while, and then you start to get really pain in place. You know, like amnesia, whatever. It's way worse than your normal. And you need to get checked out. Definitely do. All right. Circling abdominal girdle pain. I guess. Some of these things are very strange, but you can see there's a lot of possibilities. All right, treatments. So administration, first aid. So first aid that we're going to do is make sure they're breathing still, that they have a pulse. If somebody's collapsing under this, we always administer. This is what we can do: administer 100% oxygen. Do not get on a boat that has no oxygen. Period. They don't care about you if you see that anywhere in the world. It's just standard. O2 needs to be there. Your job, person who's, if you get some training, is to keep them comfortable, make sure they're hydrated, but you don't force the liquid on them. They'll tell you when they need it. And an emergency, this is a life-threatening emergency possibly, so you activate wherever you are in the world, activate that system. Here would be 911, in Mexico would be a different number, and you're out on a boat, so call it in, and so the emergency services will meet you. So this is somebody who, and this, I've got a really achy shoulder, and I've heard that before. I don't know. It may be muscle pain. Who knows? Don't take that chance. It won't necessarily go away. I'm pretty much the king of denial myself. I would get to this in way, but it doesn't get it. It's worse. Yeah, I'm sorry. So consult Dan. So everyone in here should be a member of Dan. You've got a number to call. Even if you're not a member, you can call them. They're there 24/7. They will work with the docs. They will work with you. You describe what's going on. They'll figure out whether this is really decompression sickness or not. That's the magic. Besides the fact that they'll get you somewhere where you work to a chamber if you need it. Lights still on. Anyway, they can get you. They can work with the doctors who probably won't know anything about your problems, and they'll misdiagnose it and so on. The Dan doctors will help that. Will help fix that problem so that you're diagnosed correctly. And then hopefully you're at a place. What did you say? Ponair now has a recompression chamber. That's good. Okay, so it's operating now. So California has them. As we found out, one SSI did a group of videos down there in San Carlos, and one of the people on it was the daughter of Blackie, and I guess whoever the Jefe is down there, and was his daughter. And we found out, oh, there's a chamber in Guaymas. You had to know somebody to know somebody, but there was a chamber in Guaymas. So they were drinking and they did deep dives and bounced around, and they two of them, there was his daughter and a guy that was one of the people in the video, and from Dan, and they both got bent. Well, they got bent enough that they needed a chamber. Okay. So that's what he was just telling you. They can manage, you can manage risk, but the risk can't be completely taken away. Prevention: stay hydrated, avoid the decompression stops. You know, all of these things you need to do. Don't smoke, don't drink alcohol. At least get past your dehydration problem with the hangover before you go in. And then try to stay in decent fitness. The better reason why age is a problem is your cardiovascular system is not as efficient as it was when you were 20, and it's not going to outgas as easily as efficiently as it used to. So that you've got to take that all into account, right? But if you're also way out of shape and all that, that's the same problem that you have. And then I guess the last thing is you take a few classes, learn how to dive better. You know, those are kinds of things. Learn if you haven't taken a CPR first aid class in a while, take one. So all the dive shops offer that kind of thing. Things have changed. I teach it for the Red Cross myself, and over from 2000 to here, things have changed. If you haven't taken one in a while, take one and find out what's changed and how we do it now to try to give somebody their best chance. So first aid and CPR is important to know if you're a diver. If you take rescue class, right, that's one of the requirements. So take a rescue class, learn how to help your fellow, how to rescue yourself and keep yourself out of trouble, and your dive buddy also. So we're not asking you to be a dive master who's responsible for everybody, just you and your dive buddy. That's what that rescue class is all about. All right. Is that it? All right, here's more. I'll just let you look. It's just very complex. It's very more complex than we might have thought. And that bottom one there is what I kind of learned myself. The next to the bottom one anyway. Be more conservative. You should do that anyway. If you're doing tech diving, that's a whole nother thing. Follow the rules. There's a lot of class to take, a lot to know to keep yourself alive at 200 feet or in a cave or in a wreck. You know, there's a lot there. So don't just think you can just go do that without knowing all the details. Say that again. So freshwater is not as dense, and tables are different. The computer my computer just knows what altitude I'm at and changes over to account for that. But before that, we had different tables. So if you go up to Lake Pleasant, that's freshwater, and it's also altitude at Lake Pleasant. So over 1,000 feet, that's altitude. Totally, it's a different table, a different way of different absorptions going on in your body, and so you have to add or subtract based on your altitude. Like I said, computers take care of all that, though it's a good idea to find out what's going on there, why you need to do that. And if you have a computer that doesn't automatically set for the altitude, you need to pay attention to that. Make sure you've set your computer correctly. It's very important. Your likelihood of making a mistake is really high if you read altitude. So if you go up to the Wasatch and go diving in that hot tub up there, that's quite a bit higher, and definitely you need to give yourself 24 hours before you go diving, especially if you fly in there, and then make sure that you're using the right tables and or the right calculations, which are I never do that because I make too many mistakes, and or set your computer correctly. Does that answer your question? Yeah. You usually don't get altitude diving in the ocean, but I guess if you dove in the Great Salt Lake, yeah, Tahoe is fresh. The Great Salt Lake is salt, and it's up a little bit higher. I'm sure it's above 1,000 feet. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Dan will tell you that they get the most reports they get coming out of diving from there when people are coming back to the U.S. is in Nogales. Yeah, you're going at 4,000 feet from sea level. I mean, I used to jump out of the boat. I didn't do that after the first time because you smell so bad when you get back up here. The dogs wouldn't even come close to the car. But I jumped out, threw my gear in the car, and took off. So 2 hours later or so, I'm back up at Nogales, and I've done that pretty rapidly. I was lucky, as it turned out. So they get the most reports from Nogales where you're up in the altitude, a little higher. So it's best to give yourself some time, stay overnight. I don't drive back on the same day anymore for a lot of other reasons, but that's one of them. So give yourself some time. Doesn't take you to 7,000 feet or 9,000 like the airliners do, but it's still higher. Yeah, it's 4 to 5 in that range. You're coming over a high altitude, and you're doing it quickly. That's the thing, especially the way most people drive down there, 100 miles an hour, whatever. Yeah, you come up very fast. All right, the last one there is, I mean, this is the deepest dive of the day. Do that first, and then you're basically going to decompress on the shallower dives. So if you're not, as you come up, you are decompressing. Air bubbles, the nitrogen is coming out of you. Matter of fact, if they go really deep, I was talking to one guy one instructor we had who was kind of crazy actually. He did some very strange things, but he was a research diver and he would go down quite deep. And he said, well, what they do is, so they're down at 300 feet doing something, and they pop up. So they come up to whatever that level was. I can't remember what it was. So they come up very fast and then stop. Well, you just need to stop there for the next half an hour, whatever their decompression tables told them. But it's okay to come up very fast, at least from the bottom. And that's because the pressure change is much less, the percentage change. What's the highest percentage change in pressure? Yeah, 100%. And that is where we always think we're safe, but we're not. You come up from 30 feet quickly, even though the computer says good and the tables say fine. You don't even want to come up very quickly from a 15-foot safety stop. That's a big change right there. And we always wait. Okay, 3 minutes are up, 5 minutes are up, whatever it is. Then we climb up the rope and get on the ladder. You're taking a risk. Put it that way. You're risking something there, just coming up that fast. You have no idea what's going on inside you. Again, be conservative. Okay. Still more. I had one slide here and we made it into several. So those are things. Avoid taking hot baths. Try to stay warm. Cold makes you more susceptible. Right, or sitting in the hot tub on the liveaboard dive boat that I was on. Yeah, it's not a good idea. Give yourself some time. You know, have you read what that is?
Am I back on?
Yeah,
there we go.
On.
It's the same principle as what you see when you have a hot bottle of champagne. The procedure of the releasing of the gas is going to happen much faster at a warmer temperature. So it's really built upside down from the way we normally do a dive. We're warm at the beginning of the dive on the boat. We go down, we end up getting cold at the bottom part of the dive, and on the way back up, our tissues are cooler. And then changing that immediately to a hot temperature will cause that gas to just jump out of solution, much like you have an overflow in a Coke bottle or a champagne bottle.
So when you heat it up, it comes out quicker in an unexpected way. So these are the things, gradually rewarm, rest a little bit on the surface before you come running up onto the boat. And so here's something that I started a long time ago is I got my nitrox certification even back when the computers were $1,000. And you had, if you didn't have computers, you had 3 or 4 tables you had to deal with and all that. It's still, you don't use the nitrox for time. When I'm diving with nitrox, I dive on it as if it's air, and that gives me that extra buffer for me. So if I'm diving a whole week, I pay the extra money and get nitrox, and then I try to, most of the time anyway, I will try to use it as if it, think of it as that I've got air, and that's the time and the depth that I'm gonna do. And plus, if you have nitrox, you have to test it. A few percentages difference makes a difference in what you're doing and your maximum depth that you can go. Some people think, does everyone know that there is a depth limit on nitrox? Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think you're using it to go deeper. And no, you don't. No, there's a maximum operating depth, and that's because of the oxygen toxicity over time. And again, none of that is personal to you. All of these things that they're saying is how long you can spend and how deep you can go. It's all a statistical model, and everyone's different. All biology is different. Every creature has something different, and you don't know. So try not to go to the edge, right? Don't step over to the edge of the cliff and look down. Stay away from it. Okay.
Yeah. This is the fun part. We're going to take a dive. This is Donnie Deco Diver, an invention of mine. And we're going to take him. I chose the Hilma Hooker. It's a wreck in Bonaire, where we just were. And it happens to be 99 feet right to the sand. So I'm going to take Donnie Deco Diver. I'm going to take him down to 99 feet, and he's going to spend 20 minutes exploring down there. I make the joke that you see that tiny little tank he's got, he must have an air consumption like Leslie does, so that he can spend 20 minutes at 100 feet and still have air left to breathe on the way back up. What we're going to do, these green bars represent his ceiling. So that's tissue compartment number 1, the fastest, number 2, number 3, number 4. And you see that he has developed a ceiling. If he came straight up into this, he would be in the area where his tissues would be bubbling. So if he came straight up from the bottom at the end of his 20 minutes without doing a deco stop, he would crash through these ceilings and he would probably bubble. Of course, like I said earlier, you can't predict it, but his chances of bubbling would be bad. So he's going to spend a deco stop here, and then he's going to do a 15-foot safety stop here. So if he was at 99 feet, this is the ambient pressure, is 4 atmospheres, but the pressure in his tissues is barely above what he was at ambient. It hasn't had time to saturate into his tissues yet. However, after he spends 22 minutes down there, at least the fastest of his tissue compartments is going to be almost up there to the ambient level. This represents the pressure, ambient pressure, which is what is in his regulator. And this represents the tissue tension that's in his body. So he either has the choice that he's going to stop at 2 atmospheres, 33 feet, and let this drain out for a little bit, in which case he has not exceeded that magic 1.6 to 1 or 2 to 1 tissue tension to ambient. Or the other choice is he pretty much comes back up at his 30 feet per minute. He makes it back up in a couple of minutes. And now his tissue tension has far exceeded the 1.6 to 1, and he's likely to bubble. Okay. I'm dead, Carl. Can't advance. There it is. So there's his dive profile. And here is his ceilings as they're marked off. So if he has waited for 10 minutes as a deco stop at 33 feet, he has drained enough of that he's able to get to the surface safely outside of these ceilings. His computer would tell him that his deco is expired right there. And he comes back with 681 PSI in his tank because of his low consumption rate. Now, this is the one that I'm not going to get into. However, if anybody's interested and you want to talk about gradient factors and you want to talk about M values and you want to talk about these various compartments and how you calculate this stairway is basically how you do your decompression. You have to get back to the surface in this area or you risk just the same as you saw the giant red X on Donnie's profile. That's this area. Anyway, I'll be glad to talk about that if anybody wants it. This is my own apex dive. This is Eric Brooks was my tech instructor, and he took me on this dive, and this is the actual data from my computer. This red area represents the area that I had a ceiling over me. This is 152 feet at the peak. This was in San Carlos 2 years ago. There happened to be a thermocline at 147 feet. So we dipped down to 152 feet there and we're freezing. So we came back up and we did the bottom part of our dive at about 145 feet and then dipped back to 150 at the end. So you see, we came back up to 70 feet where we switched gases and breathed in 50% oxygen for a faster deco. And then you see how slow this is from the 70-foot mark until the deco stop up here, 25 feet. That's like a good 10, 15 minutes. And then this is the actual deco. We waited at 20 feet until well after the ceiling was gone. And then here's the final safety stop. The entire dive was the deco stop, I believe 20 minutes. Let's see, that was 32. No, about 15 minutes. So this is much of the same stuff that Vance just talked about. Your biggest risk factors: dehydration, obesity, stress, whether it be stress during the dive or just your own stress in your body. Interestingly, postmenopausal women, for some reason, seem to be more prone, so they should be more careful with their profiles. Thermal stress, cold water. If you're cold during the dive, you're more likely. I mentioned that earlier when we talked about the heat. Alcohol, tobacco use. And if you go on an airline or a mountain pass, or you're ascending faster than 30 feet, those are the things that are going to put you at risk. Here's an interesting one. Here's a woman, Ms. S. Went on a series of recreational dives, the same as we always do. No risky profiles, no extra deep dives. She suffered 2 episodes over a period of months of undeserved DCS. Testing revealed she had a heart defect. This is the patent foramen ovale that maybe you heard about way back when you did your open water class. And it's actually a hole in the heart. We all have this hole in our heart because our mothers did our breathing for us when we were still in the womb. And it's not until an infant starts to breathe that a little flap comes over and closes this off when your lungs come into the circuit. In her case, that flap was not properly sealed, and some of the gases that were in her blood did not get a chance to escape into the atmosphere, come out through her lungs. So the lungs get bypassed, and some of the gas was getting through. So she went in, she had a surgical repair, and she has not had an incident since. I thought that was interesting. As many as 1 in 4 people have some form of this defect. And it's generally not even considered you don't even know you have it. And the third story I have was what we talked about earlier. We had some guys returning from San Carlos. Mr. B was a manufacturer's rep, and he had a brand new computer that he was testing out down in Nogales, or not Nogales, in San Carlos. It came back through Nogales. He completed 3 dives over 100 feet in one day. He was taking his new dive computer down to test it and went down below 100 feet over and over. I got the story secondhand, but drank way too much tequila after those 3 dives and got up in the morning, drove back through Nogales. He probably already had bubbles in his system that he was able to live with overnight. But when they drove back through Nogales, he got severely bent and had to ride the chamber 3 or 4 times. That's an actual true story. So Vance went over this too. Don't come up fast. Make sure that the 30 feet per minute, less is better than that. Always do your safety stop. Those of you that have been diving with me know that I'm a kind of a stickler. I will do 3 to 5 minutes all the time, even if it's a shallow dive. My article this month that was in the newsletter was every dive is a deco dive. And that's really true. You can use nitrox or helitrox to reduce the amount of nitrogen that's in your breathing mix. Longer surface intervals, spend some time on the boat in between your dives. Don't be in such a rush to go 20 minutes and get back in the water. Never dive. I'd never dive the whole day before I'm flying out. Airlines only provide about 8,000 feet of pressure. So you can easily have too much of a differential between the bubbles that are in your system and the external. Minutes. And stay in good physical shape. And during the dive, you want to stay relaxed. You want to reduce the stress. We all do. If you're in cold water and you're stressing out and you're fighting a current, you're asking for trouble. This is a suggested reading list. This is published in this month's newsletter. These are some excellent articles. If you just want to look at something, the Dive Right articles are really easy to read, and they explain how some of the deco works. This guy, Andy Davis, and Scuba Tech Philippines, he writes about everything related to scuba. It's an excellent, excellent website to look at, and he writes articles about all this. Anybody have any questions? Thank you. Appreciate it. That's better. So it's just like the up and down profile, the yo-yo profile, where you've developed a higher pressure, you let it off. Then you have a medium pressure, you let that off. And it's almost like you're doing deco stops over the course of a day, as opposed to starting off with a medium dive and then do a deep dive. And now you're pressurizing, you're going, the tension in your tissues is going the wrong direction. You're building it up rather than letting it off. So it's kind of like a gradual release of pressure.
They investigate the accidents and then they come up with what happened. Why is that? So they're keeping track of all that. So some of it is they don't actually have a good, I mean, this one we kind of know, a good explanation about why it happens. All they know is that it does. And that's what they're seeing, right? So take that as you will. But as I said, none of this stuff that you're seeing in your computers or in the dive tables or any of that has anything to do with you personally. So everyone's going to be different. So that's like the 15-foot stop. It's not a decompression stop. They refuse to say that because we can't say that diving is dangerous at all. So, but it is. It's actually what's actually going on. But what's happened is there's less problems for people who do that than there is for people who don't do that, and that's what they're seeing. Over time, you're actually more likely to get hurt in badminton, well, bowling, I guess, because you can throw a ball at somebody. You're not likely to get hurt with sport than you are with other sports than this one. But part of that's the training that we do. But again, the dirty little secret, and this is the dirty little secret in most medicine, we don't know what causes it to happen to you. I don't know why I get the flu one year and I don't get it the next year, and you don't know why, any of that stuff. They don't know. So we don't know what causes the bends. We don't know what causes DCS. We know mechanics about it, but we don't know really what causes it. If we did, we could predict it, but we can't. And you saw that. One of the things I wanted you to see was that long, long list of things. It's very complicated. It's like trying to predict the weather. Very complicated, a lot of factors involved. You can do the same profile in the afternoon that you did in the morning. You'll get bent in the afternoon, not in the morning. Why is that? We don't know. A lot of different factors.
Thank you. Anybody else? We're good. Phil?
It works, you're fine. Decompression treatments can be incredibly expensive, especially if they have to haul you someplace to get you in a chamber. If you are a DAN member, they cover, you get the insurance to cover that cost. Strongly suggest that. It's been quite a few years back. I ended up having to do a chamber treatment out on Santa Catalina Island in California. And mine was more of a precautionary thing than it was. I didn't have decompression sickness. Didn't get bent. What I had was moderate hypothermia, which has some similar types of characteristics. That 6.5 hour chamber ride that I did was not any fun at all. It was real drag. It would have been a lot worse if it had to answer to my wife as to why we had to pay that bill rather than having Dan do it. Dan took it. We didn't even hear from those guys. We didn't even get any kind of bill or anything from them. So if you're not a Dan member, Dan Divers Network member, strongly suggest, look into it and become a member. It can save you, probably save your life and probably save you financially as well.
Does is they know where the chambers that are available are located. They know where the chamber is, but it's not in use right now. They know where they're transport to where the chamber is. That's like the money part.
Does anybody else want an endorsement out of Dan?
He said, far and away, the most common thing is the shoulder pain. And he said, one of those things with the old joke, doctor, it hurts when I do this. Don't do that. It doesn't matter what you do with it. The pain stays constant. And he said, it's almost always in the shoulder.
Two real quick ones. Daniel was on one of our Bonaire trips. He said, it hurts. It hurts when I do this. Don't do this. But he did the chamber for 6 hours. Dan picked up every penny of it. The other one is 7 years ago, April 9th, we lost Tony in Bonaire. Dan picked up every penny of it, took every caution. They took all care of him. They sent him home, and we never heard another word. So you got to have Dan or some other kind of insurance. So please consider that when you go on one of my trips. I want you to have Dan or some other insurance. So with that, we're going to turn this over to our raffle people, and we're going to go from there. So